Now that we have our conclusion and premise statements identified, we can move on to step 2. Step 2 is to identify or create terms. Did you write that down? Step number 2, identify or create terms. Remember, we're ultimately looking for a standard form categorical syllogism that has a total of 3 terms that appear 2 times each in the exact same way. So what we want to do is we want to start working through the argument, identifying the terms of this argument. And to do that, I recommend just simply starting with your first premise and start with the very first part of your first premise. What's being talked about in the very first part of your first premise? Here we have diseases carried by recessive genes. And what's interesting about that as a term is I can use that as a term without having to modify it at all. I can just simply designate a letter to represent diseases carried by recessive genes. And here I'm going to use the letter D. And now I can just keep moving through the argument looking for more terms. And I see this one, can be inherited by offspring of 2 carriers. And this is a more problematic term than the first term because this is not a plural noun or noun phrase. And I know that the terms of my argument have to be plural nouns or noun phrases. They have to be things I can count. And I can't say I have 5 can be inherited by offspring of 2 carriers. That doesn't make any sense. So I've got to figure out a way to create a term that will represent this part of the argument. And I think we can do that with something like this. Diseases that can be inherited by offspring of 2 carriers. That's a plural noun phrase. I can count how many of those there are. And we're going to use I to refer to that term. And we're just going to keep moving through the argument looking for terms. And here we come across cystic fibrosis as another part of this argument. But it's, again, not a plural noun or noun phrase. I can't have 5 cystic fibrosis. But I can create a term to represent cystic fibrosis that is countable. So I might use the letter C to refer to diseases identical to cystic fibrosis. And I keep moving through the argument and I'm looking for any more terms or term complements. And so we see we have here is a disease carried by recessive genes, but we've already got that one. And we've also got it can be inherited by 2 offspring of 2 carriers. And we've already got that one too. Okay, so now we've got our 3 terms for this argument, and we've created all of them as countable plural nouns or noun phrases, and now we get to move on to step 3.